Hi again. John Stott in his The Message of Acts. This is a meditation on Paul's assault and arrest, and this is Acts 21 verses 27 to 36. Subhead: Paul is assaulted by the Jews. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Stott comments, it was in connection with the 7-day purification ritual and near its end that Paul was in the temple. He was recognized by some Jews from proconsular Asia, probably from Ephesus itself. They seemed also to have recognized Trophimus the Ephesian. They provoked the worshipping crowd to frenzy by 2 accusations. The first of these was a misunderstanding, for they represented Paul as teaching everybody, everywhere, against our people and our law and this place. It is ironical, Howard Marshall justly comments, that this should have been the charge against Paul at a time when he himself was undergoing purification, so that he would not defile the temple. The charge was similar to that laid against Stephen, who was accused by false witnesses of speaking against the holy place and against the law, back in chapter 6, verse 13. But the Jews misunderstood both Stephen and Paul, just as they had misunderstood Jesus. Jesus spoke of himself as the fulfillment of the temple, the people, and the law, and Stephen and Paul followed suit. This was not to denigrate them, however, but to reveal their true glory. The second accusation, that Paul had brought Greeks into the temple area and so defiled it, was simply untrue. It was not a deliberate lie, Luke charitably adds, but rather an assumption on their part. They had seen Trophimus, whom they knew to be a Gentile, with Paul in the city, and had jumped to the conclusion that Paul had also brought him into the temple's inner court, which was forbidden to Gentiles. Gentiles were permitted to enter only the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. Beyond this, and preventing access into the court of Israel, there was a stone wall for a partition 4.5 feet high, with an inscription which forbade any foreigner to go in under pain of death. This is Josephus' description, and he added that there were many such inscriptions written in Greek and in Latin at equal distance from each other. F.F. Bruce adds, 2 of these notices, both in Greek, have been found, one in 1871 and one in 1935, the text of which runs, quote, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." End of quote. Titus, the Roman general and later emperor, reminded the Jews that the Romans had even given them leave to kill such as go beyond it, that is the barricade, though he were a Roman. Paul was surely thinking of this barrier when he wrote of the dividing wall of the hostility between Jews and Gentiles. The combination of these 2 accusations, the one a half-truth and the other an untruth, was enough to bring people running from all directions, according to verse 30, who proceeded to seize Paul, drag him out of the inner court, and try to kill him. Fortunately, soldiers of the Roman garrison, always on the lookout for public disorder in Jerusalem, saw what was happening and rescued him in the nick of time. Their barracks were in the fortress of Antonia, which Herod the Great had built at the northwest corner of the temple area. The garrison usually consisted of 1,000 men. In charge of them was a cheliarchos, which can be translated military tribune, a commander of the Roman troops, or a colonel of the regiment. At this time we know that he was Claudius Lysias. Hearing that the city was in an uproar, he rushed down personally with some officers and men, and the rioters at once gave up beating Paul. This section is subtitled, Paul is arrested by the Romans. That's Acts 21, verses 33 to 36. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him!" Stott comments, it's noteworthy that the same verb is used both of the mob seizing Paul in verse 30 and of the commander arresting him in verse 33, although they had opposite objectives. The crowd were bent on lynching him, the military tribune on taking him into protective custody. It's a striking example of Luke's aim to contrast Jewish hostility with Roman justice. When the commander failed to discover who the prisoner was and what he had done, because of the hubbub, he had him taken, indeed, owing to the mob's violence, carried into the barracks. Meanwhile, the crowd was shouting away with him, just as nearly 30 years previously, another crowd had shouted about another prisoner. Next time, the Jews slander Paul. I should say that's a link we're putting on this, our discussion of this very section, where we make the point that the Jews slandered Paul just as they had slandered the Lord 30 years prior, as Stott notes here. Next time, Paul defends himself before the crowd. That's the end of 21 and into chapter 22.